Hey, Barry. Barry, can you hear me?
Yep.
I just woke up, so I just started Zoom, and I discovered that Zoom did update itself, but now I cannot find my camera. So I'm trying to figure out how to activate my camera.
Are you running Zoom 5.11 dot something?
It just said overnight Zoom updated itself, so I haven't.
Yeah. Yes, it's 5.11 dot something. That was the one that didn't even launch at all on my older Mac, and I had to revert back. But I mean, if you go to the settings for the camera.
I know how to do that. I've done that before. It's just not recognizing it. So I either have to unplug it and plug it back in. And I got so many cables, that'll take several minutes.
Yeah, that's one thing I used to do. I used to unplug the, I guess it's a USB cable for the camera and then plug it back in again. That worked.
Yeah, so I'm gonna go downstairs and see if I can use that one. So give me a minute or two and I'll be back.
Okay.
And yeah, I hope that camera has not updated itself with the same problem. So I'll be right there.
Yeah. Good morning, Joshua.
Good morning, Barry.
How are you?
I don't know, man. I'm still waking up. I just heard the national anthem over a loudspeaker. I'm like, I must be in San Diego. That was weird. 8 a.m. in the morning. Such a strange thing.
Yeah, maybe some event at some concert venue or
it's the military. There's a big military presence here. So
oh yeah, that's right. There's the Navy base.
Yeah, I think it was coming from like the Navy base, like a mile. I don't know where it was coming from. It was so strange.
Well, if you're a mile from the sea, yeah, probably this Navy base.
I think so. Yeah, I'm right near the sea, so maybe it was coming from the naval base. That's weird to blast at 8 in the morning, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. The other thing that's weird about San Diego is that the airport is practically downtown, and planes land. They go directly over downtown en route to the landing.
I just noticed that. That now that you say that, I'm like, it is quite close to downtown. That is most. I think does Boston have that where Logan was not that close?
The thing is that in Boston they land coming in over Boston Harbor, over the water. So they don't, unless the wind is in the completely wrong direction, they almost always land coming in over the water.
Yeah, they screwed up this city because here's a plane going over right now. You can hear it.
Yeah. So
that's poor city planning.
Well, of course, all those big cities in California go back to the 1800s. So.
Not the planes, though. They knew to put the airport somewhere else. They knew what they were doing.
That's true. I mean, I guess, although San Diego might have been considerably smaller when they decided to site the airport, possibly.
Yep.
Okay.
Sam, you got your camera working? Is that what I'm seeing?
Yeah, I'm downstairs now, so the camera is working here.
Okay.
Could you hear me okay also?
Yep.
All right, Barry. If I remember correctly, at the end of yesterday, we were going to do a deep dive into Deep Barry.
Okay. That sounds kinky.
And I said I was going to interview you.
Right. Remember that.
How would you like to set the stage for this, if that's all right?
Well, one way I could set the stage is that I can remind people who were attending that a decade ago, a documentary filmmaker came out to my house to interview me for a film that he was making, but it turned out he ran out of funds and never made the film. but he had footage of a long, long interview with me. I think it was like 2.5 hours. And he was sitting on that footage for a decade. And finally, he decided to edit it into a YouTube, pair of YouTube videos. And he recently uploaded those to YouTube and made them public. And they probably have a lot of the same ideas in that interview, which is kind of a monologue. So it will not be the first time that any of this material has appeared. In addition to that particular video interview, I've posted in text pretty much everything that would be worth talking about, stuff that I've thought about with some depth over 15, 20, sometimes longer number of years. So there won't be anything that you couldn't have found earlier, but maybe squirreled away in some obscure location where it hasn't come to everybody's attention.
Right. So here's an opportunity to do it in a live fashion for those who prefer to hear it or view it and sort of get it in a streaming format. So I have to admit, I have not watched that entire video. I'm partway into it. So the issue, as I recall, and then you can correct me, is that someone within the Wikimedia Foundation found offense at the way you were pointing out how certain rules were being applied inconsistently.
Yes.
Dare I say hypocritically?
You could say that. Corruptly,
Okay.
maybe.
Corruptly, okay. And also, just as a disclaimer and in full transparency, I am kind of a regular donor to Wikimedia Foundation because I like to support Wikipedia and what it's doing. So I'm not privy to the specifics, although I've heard you recount them 2 or 3 or 4 times in GCC. But I still think in general, they're still doing a service that's overall beneficial. Now, it would be curious to see if we could get them to, I guess, acknowledge what it is you're saying. I'm not saying that this will do that, but it's another opportunity for you to sort of lay out what it is that you felt was happening. But actually, I'm more interested in the larger picture, not just around the Wikimedia Foundation, but just this whole issue, perhaps extending all the way back to ethics and the reasons for ethics and its rational basis and how ethics is synchronous. I don't know if I've introduced that word with you.
Synchronous, I'm not recognizing that as a word in my working vocabulary.
It's one worth looking up. So let's get into that when we get into that. So can we expand from the Wikipedia experience into the larger picture? Would you like to do that?
Sure. The interesting thing about Wikipedia is that it didn't even have much of a governance model at all for its active community. And in fact, one of the
talk about what year this was, okay? Because they do believe they have an engagement model for people who do edit articles now.
Yeah, this would have been 2008 through about 2010 when I was attempting to be active there and got unceremoniously booted out of the system by none other than Jimmy Wales himself. But one of the top level administrators who was running, can't remember what position he was running for, but candidates for some kind of high level position who have to be voted on typically answer questions. And I asked him about due process, and he admitted Wikipedia does not have a concept of due process. It's simply not present in their system, and that if anybody gets accused of doing something inappropriate, there is no such thing as due process. Somebody can act as accuser, judge, jury, and executioner. One person can basically, who's got a modest level of power, play all roles of judge, jury, and executioner, and kick somebody off, and there's no appeal. And that was one of the issues that I and other people had run into. In fact, I believe, you can double check if you don't already know this, that Doug Breitbart had run into something like that. And this whole thing of his about blocking stemmed from examples such as the one in Wikipedia where people would get blocked for pissing off some empowered administrator. But the point, to broaden it out a bit, when I was doing online community building in the early 90s, when the internet was just becoming available to the general public and in particular children whose parents were in high tech, so that they would have, the children would have access to the internet at home. It was a pretty elite group. I started one of the pioneering online learning communities that would be appropriate for adolescents and also adults. And again, it needed to have a community governance model. And I proposed a social contract governance model, which is not very common. In fact, most people might not even have heard of a social contract governance model, as opposed to an empowered administrator who makes and enforces the rules. And I didn't want to be the policeman who had basically make the rules and then enforce them. And so I proposed that this pioneering community employ the social contract model, which is a topic in, well, what would be the name of the subject? I guess ethics and governance in general. There's a model due to Lawrence Kohlberg of Harvard, which talked about 5 levels of system regulation, from sort of kindergarten level of rules all the way up to sort of, you know, a kind of a Dalai Lama, Martin Luther King, Jesus Christ level, maximum level of self management. And of this sort of 5 or 6 levels, the next one just below the very top was the social contract model. So I was familiar with it because I had used it, and I realized that Wikipedia was operating like a couple of rungs lower on this Kohlberg ladder below the social contract model. And I found it really very off-putting how crude and inadequate it was, and was given to corruption and systemic injustice built into the system. And I argued about issues resolving around that, and the people who wanted to have the power to kick people off basically prevailed because they had the power to kick people off. So among other things, I got marginalized, and finally Jimmy Wales came in and personally locked me out of Wikipedia at the end of that. But it was quite an interesting revelation of just how crude the governance model was, at least back in the 2008, 2010 epoch. And I really don't know if it's evolved since then.
So let's ask you a question about it. In your view, since years have gone by, do you think that Wikimedia Foundation now does have a model for resolving these conflicts, or some kind of a way to administer the operations of Wikipedia so that it's quote unquote fair and ethical?
I don't really think so. I mean, the only issue that they have a governance mechanism for is fights among administrators. So they have the arbitration committee, which is sort of the Supreme Court, but the arbitration committee will only take up cases where there's an allegation that an administrator was behaving corruptly. If there's a dispute over content of articles, what belongs in an article and what's unreliable information or misinformation, they do not have a mechanism for resolving whether the content of articles that people are arguing over can be adjudicated. And in fact, one of the administrators said that accuracy is not a criterion for the content on Wikipedia. The only criterion is if you can find some reliable source that asserts something, it doesn't matter if the assertion is reliable or correct or not. If you can find even one reliable source, then that suffices to put something into an article. And even if you can demonstrate that it's incorrect, you basically good luck. And if you argue over trying to get it out, you might end up going to the arbitration committee, and the arbitration committee will only say who was the most egregious combatant in this conflict.
So This may sound like it's bouncing around, but I do want to make some connection. I think in GCC, when the initial group of admins got together, there also, in my opinion, wasn't a structured or documented or agreed upon way in which GCC was going to be administered, right? So in the early days, anybody could add another administrator to the group of administrators. Anybody could post almost anything, right?
Okay.
And we've certainly seen at least 3 or 4 different examples of how that created certain issues. Now, the question is, had we put some structure in there in the first place, would we have eliminated some of the positive behavior that has come out of GCC in the last 5 years? Or would it have been a net positive to say, yes, had we spent the amount of time to actually come up with that structure, we could have eliminated the weeks or months of discussions around some of these incidents that we've had in the past. So that's a question I would pose and sort of bring that connection back to GCC as well.
Yeah. Joshua put his hand up. Let's pause and listen to Joshua for a minute.
Just curious how much time, because I thought we spent a good amount of time on that and talked about every governance model from here to Zimbabwe.
But we didn't actually come up with an agreement around it. That's the problem.
I've never heard you say that phrase ever, Sam.
Which
That's what you
phrase?
always say is we never came up with an agreement around that. It was literally an impossibility to come up with an agreement around that because we never came up with an agreement around who we're agreeing with.
That's right.
But yeah,
That's right.
so that was the loop in the system. You can draw it right in the map. It's so simple. I just want to be clear that we didn't not know what we're doing. We knew exactly what we're doing and we did it on purpose.
Well, some of the early practice of it would not display such a claim, however. Some of the people that did certain things in the admin group weren't even part of these discussions. So actions were taken, kind of unilaterally at times. So I just wanted to bring that back to GCC. And as a result, if we don't know who's in, then we don't know who to consult to make these agreements, and therefore these agreements don't get made. Therefore, we continue the way we have been. Therefore, other people just get frustrated. And that's why I'm trying to do something new on Sundays. Over.
Can I ask a quick question that's been plaguing me for these years, Sam?
Sure.
Clarify. Did you not want to cap off a certain amount of people to make an agreement, or did you just want it naturally to occur, or what was the thinking of not capping off a certain amount of people taking a vote?
Good question. It was a personal experiment. The experiment was, could we, in a community with no person having more power or more sway or more dominance than anyone else, could we come up with a model where we didn't have to install such power, where we could be more egalitarian? But the way the discussions went on and the defocus that random people could bring to that process meant that it was very hard. I still don't think it's impossible. I think it is possible. But the level of awareness within each individual who wants to play in such a community, in my opinion, must increase, must level up. So I don't think we actually had that within GCC, is my opinion.
So hopefully we don't get any bad apples in the bunch. Was that the thinking?
No, hopefully that whoever comes in who does not understand the distractions and chaos that they may create, hopefully becomes aware that that's what's happening and that they attain that level of awareness.
But there was
only in that way can we have, an egalitarian community essentially run itself, in my opinion.
So basically anarchy. We were practicing anarchy.
No, it's basically a structuring that is emergent. I'm trying to see whether or not we can do that. Not complete loss of rules, not complete devoid of structure, but I'm trying to see whether we could actually co-emerge that. And that was the experiment in my mind. Now, there are many other experiments others could have done. I wasn't trying to eliminate, what anybody else is trying to do. This is my own personal question that I was trying to ask.
No, I got it. I remember when PKE started, the reason why we started it was to cap it off so we could have a group outside of the GCC group that we capped off and could start doing something without allowing it to emerge, because that would take forever. Sorry, these planes are annoying. I wish they would not have planes downtown in San Diego. Can you guys hear
Yeah,
me?
curiously, we're not hearing the planes, but your voice is becoming more distorted.
Yeah, when the planes
Yeah.
go over, it's hard to make out what you're saying.
Yeah, I apologize. It's leaving in 2 seconds, and I'll mic up. I'll mute before the next one comes by.
No need to apologize. It's not your.
Yeah, but I should have my headphones charged, and I don't. So that's why I'm apologizing. But yada yada yada. If you allow anyone to join and you don't set a limit on when they're allowed to make an agreement, meaning if they can make an agreement that moment, anyone could just come in right now, make an agreement. And then if there's 7 people, that's 1/7 of the whole entire organization, which is a large vote.
Yeah.
Or according to if one person came in, it'd be 1/5 of the entire conversation. So that's where I was always like, are we crazy, or are we just not wanting to have a voting roster?
Okay, so this is getting a little bit away from inquiring into Barry, but let me answer your question. The question is, not only do we 4 or 5 or 7 actually then come to a momentary agreement, the question is, can we then operationalize it or institutionalize it or bleep, even remember it? So the whole issue of creating artifacts, writing things down, making them accessible, sharing them, making them reviewable, making them editable, making them refinable, making them improvable, that whole process, in my opinion, stalled when people didn't seem to accept this notion of shared group memory and shared writing of things. So I think that is essential in a process where we actually are trying to make a move from time A to time A plus delta T or whatever. Without that, you don't have memory. And without memory, you don't have agreements, in my opinion. Over.
Without agreement on where to store the memory, we don't have memory. And that was where we got stalled.
No, in fact, I thought I tried personally to unblock that. I could say, put it anywhere as long as people know how to get to it. And that was evidently not even possible.
But we never agreed that we don't know how to get to it.
Yeah, I
And
think
then
that
we
was
never, when we put up one sheet, which I put up a website. Yeah, anyway, I'm not trying to rehash everything, and I want to hear the rest of Barry's story. I have heard about the Wikipedia, but I want to get further on. So I will be quiet. I just want to be clear that it's not that we didn't try, it's that we set up a system that was not closed, so therefore the system never enacted.
right.
So
Right.
we still have
these are good questions. I'm not.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't think these are bad questions. I think these are
Oh
reflective.
no, thank you. It helps me. No, I love your experiments. Now I'm still in it. I'm here.
Well, we're hearing from people here. Kayla, welcome.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Am I
Yes.
on? Oh no, I'm not on mute. Yay! Hello. How are you guys? I'm just enjoying listening to you.
We started this because yesterday Barry was curious about people who may be receptive to the ideas that he's been writing up over the last decade or two. And with the small number of people that Barry feels are reading his blog posts, he feels that his impact is perhaps less than it could be. So I offered to Barry this session today to say, Barry, why don't we do this session and let you fully expound? So rather than blog posts, maybe it's a streaming format or at least a video format where people may be able to get it in a different channel, in a different style, different way. So that's what we're doing. And I started this with Barry setting the context, and I offered to interview him.
Got it.
So one of the things that was central to the social contract governance model, at least the version that we developed back in the 1990s, was the presence of a conflict resolution protocol. That was a main feature of the charter and the social contract. Because conflict is inevitable and can be very healthy, but conflict needs to be resolved or managed in a constructive way so it doesn't just go haywire. And one of the things that I found a little bit disconcerting about some of the early GCC sessions was the amount of pointless debate, the endless debate, that people would pick a position and an opposite position, and they would just banter back and forth, essentially endlessly, and never getting to common ground, and just using up an enormous amount of bandwidth, enormous amount of time, and nothing constructive came out of it. No learning came out of it. Just calcified positions. And that tends to drive people away who want something better than just to be sitting, with their eyes glazed over while people argue endlessly over unresolvable belief systems or opinions. And in the project called Micromuse, we did have a conflict resolution mechanism that was actually multiple layers. So we tried to resolve conflicts first at one layer, and if that failed, then we'd escalate to the next higher layer. And eventually, if it couldn't be resolved within the system, the parties had to agree up front, because this was part of the social contract, that they would then take their conflict to some resolution process outside of the community if it couldn't be resolved inside. So we're sort of 2 layers inside and then finally take it outside, but don't continue to noise up the system if it can't be resolved. And it was pretty effective. I won't say it's perfect, but one of the interesting anecdotes is that we did have an episode where an adolescent who had been given administrative power to do some building in the virtual world abused his power. He basically created a kind of a trap where people were lured into a trap, and then he sort of abused them because they couldn't get out of this trap. He had the power to sort of lock them up. And that led to a complaint of abuse of power. And at the time, I really didn't have any supervisory power other than being a co-founder of the site. And I was asked by the main guy who basically had started the site if I would act as the judge of a hearing so that this complaint could be aired and resolved. So having absolutely no experience in a judicial role, I took the role of the administrative judge in a hearing. And by the way, that entire transcript is recorded, and you can actually go and read the transcript of the exchange. It's up on my website. It's been there for, 25 years. And it was a demonstration of what you could do if you have some kind of a reasonable conflict resolution mechanism. So that was one of the beneficial gains, that conflicts don't end up basically destroying the whole system. And other social communities, forums did get destroyed because conflicts basically never got adequately resolved. And finally, some authority figure would pick one person and kick them out. And that turned out not to be a very, well, there wasn't any fair resolution process. Now, is it perfect? No. And in fact, one of our adults was a professional who did, for a living, teach conflict resolution and act as an arbitrator in real life, mainly in labor disputes. But she had lots of experience in conflict resolution. And so she was kind of our guiding light in terms of effectuating conflict resolution in a reasonably efficient way. And she ended up, after a few years, writing a chapter in a book about her experiences in this role of the senior expert in conflict resolution in early online social communities. And you can still go out. In fact, I think I have the link somewhere on my website. You can actually read that chapter, the online version of it. And like I say, it wasn't perfect. There were cases where basically there was somebody who was incorrigible. They just couldn't discipline themselves, or they didn't have enough self-discipline to adhere to the terms of engagement. But they were rare, but you had to deal with them eventually. And so we did eventually exclude a small number of people who could not, for whatever reason, abide by the terms of engagement that were laid out in the social contract. But that at least allowed the rest of the people to have a constructive and positive experience and not have to be subjected to this never-ending combat
Let
scenario.
me ask you a question then.
Sure.
If GCC, which was this experiment, is trying to be applicable to the planet, in other words, have planetary impact, is it appropriate or is it not appropriate? And is it effective? It is not effective to actually have that exclusion option.
I think ultimately it's necessary because there will be people who can literally wreck a system. I mean, I won't go to so far as to say, well, they have to be psychopaths, but maybe just sociopaths or some joker who basically who says they agree to the terms of the social contract, but then simply depart from them routinely. And if you have somebody who has a persistent pattern of departing from the terms of engagement, such that you can see not just a one-off case or 2 times, but multiple times, it's sort of like the 3 strikes you're out. Typically, it was more than 3 times, but if they had a persistent pattern, then the quote elders of the community would do their best to rehabilitate them. And if the rehabilitation process failed, then you basically had to exclude them. And that was turned out unavoidable because there are people who will lie their way into a community and not abide by the terms of engagement. That just turns out to be empirically a phenomenon that does happen.
So here's another small aside. Is lying sufficient grounds immediately and of itself to be grounds for exclusion?
I wouldn't say immediately, because people can be misinformed and repeat something that's a falsehood without necessarily knowing for a fact that it's a falsehood. People repeat stuff that they've heard without having done critical evaluation or hypothesis testing or somehow confirming it. So you have to distinguish a falsehood, which is sort of an innocent repetition of a falsehood, from a deceptive practice where a person knows for a fact that they're spreading disinformation. And so that takes a little while to resolve. And I'll just give you an example. Yesterday, I was chatting with that new Meta chatbot, the BlenderBot 3. And the BlenderBot 3 was pulling material from the public web, some of which is misinformation. Just, kind of sloppy stuff that's out there. And maybe the experts in the field know that it's unreliable, but they're still kind of quote unquote public knowledge. And I found it very difficult to convince this chatbot that it was relying on information that had been debunked, but was still tons and tons of it out there in the public domain. And I found it would get into a loop. It would keep repeating the same material that can be debunked, but the debunking is really by means of the protocols of the scientific method, adhered to with great discipline and great rigor. And these chatbots don't have great discipline and great rigor in employing the protocols of the scientific method. So you kind of run into, how am I going to convince this thing? And maybe I can, and maybe I can, and maybe we just have to change the subject. Go ahead, Sam.
So I don't want to address your experience with the chatbot, but
Okay.
may I infer that what you're saying is that experience with a chatbot you often have with actual real humans? Absolutely.
In fact, I have had essentially the same conversation with people, say in the comments on a YouTube channel on some scientific, because YouTube channels on science often get to the frontier where they're overthrowing some previous model that has been found wanting, at least at some special cases. And people are still reciting things that they've memorized. This is what Feynman called Brazilian physics, where you find something in a book and you memorize it and recite it as if it's correct, even though it's been superseded by better models that may not be very well known, or better models that require more mathematics than you can really explain in narrative forms to a person who doesn't have the math. So yeah, the thing about the chatbot was that it was much starker, because you knew the chatbot was simply echoing stuff that it picked up. In fact, it would literally repeat it word for word. Okay. I would ask it, what is your source for that? And it wouldn't disclose it, even though it had pulled it off of some website or some Wikipedia page or who knows where. Go ahead, Sam.
Okay, so this is an interesting distinction that I would like to delve into. This issue of whether I say a statement, let's call it S, okay?
Yeah.
And that at some time T0, S was pretty much accepted as quote unquote true by most of people who actually were reasonable.
Yeah.
And then at some other time, S has been supplanted by S prime, a revision of S.
Right.
Where we now know better, quote unquote, based on more data, more reasoning, more experimentation. Contrast that, okay, call that scenario A. Did I use A already? Okay, call that scenario A. Scenario B is where S is widely known by most people to be not true. But there's a small group of people who believe it, either one or some number, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so call that B, okay?
The flat
Now,
earth.
I believe in A, if you're espousing S, that is non-malicious, that is non-damaging. That was, one being the best person one could be. Whereas in scenario B, if you espouse S, you're aware that most people do not accept S as true, but you're espousing it anyway.
Yeah.
So I would say there's this difference between those two. One you might say is lying. I would say B is closer to what I would call lying, whereas A is not necessarily lying, right? Because you and I both believe, I believe you and I both believe that S will always be supplanted by S prime and then S prime prime and S prime 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 over time.
Yep.
So all we can do is just the best we know at a certain time.
Yep.
Right. So that's a discernment I would like to lay out for you, because if someone is just repeating something that's not true, then is it really lying? You have to, I think, look at whether it's in the A category or in the B category, in my opinion.
Yeah, misinformation versus disinformation.
Right, right. So I think there's a certain intention that is very much different in quality between A and B.
Yeah, there is. But it's often not easy to determine whether a person believes the misinformation, naively but genuinely believes it, versus they know that it's unreliable and is losing a stature, but they assert it anyway. That's knowingly spreading misinformation, which is to say disinformation. But it isn't easy to resolve the case, at least in the first, at least initially. Now, maybe eventually you can get evidence that when they're not talking publicly, privately, they have been revealing that they know it's false. And when that leaks out, then you can get evidence to say, okay, this person knows they're lying.
Right. Because in either way, there's another dimension which you just called out, which is, do you actually believe S yourself, or do you not believe S yourself?
Right.
Okay. If you know that most people do not accept S, and you still believe S, there's a certain naivete to that.
Right.
If you actually know that most people do not accept S, and you yourself don't accept S, but you repeat it and you talk about it as if it were true,
right,
then that is disingenuous. Dare I say, even lying.
Exactly. Disingenuous is a very good word there. And it isn't easy. You can assert that somebody is being disingenuous, but you don't really know it for sure. It's just a suspicion. But eventually you can get enough evidence to say that this person is just trolling, for example. Trolling is an example of being disingenuous, just to get a rise out of people, just for the laughs of the amusement of doing it. And on the internet, this business of trolling for laughs is a phenomenon that's, you become familiar with this phenomenon, but you don't always know if a fresh instance is trolling, a person is simply naive and naively repeating something that's baloney.
Okay, so let's go back to the Wikimedia incident, okay? The people who were actually attempting to resolve this issue, perhaps unilaterally or perhaps, in an ad hoc fashion, were they, do you believe, acting in the best interests of the community, or were they acting in a way that was trying to oppress?
The latter, because they were departing from their own guidelines for how to employ power. And the ones who employed power against me to marginalize and silence me were manifestly departing from the guidelines. Now, I didn't know enough about the guidelines for administrators to be able to point that out. But in the fullness of time, because I wasn't the only example of a person who was treated that way, it became clear that they had dramatically, manifestly departed from their own guidelines for the application of administrative power. But I couldn't prove it at the time because I was too naive about, what administrators could or couldn't do and how they had to go about it. For example, giving notification. If you're going to use administrative power, there was an administrator's notice board where you had to reveal that you were using it. And if you didn't put it on the administrator's notice board, then you were evading the the peer review, the awareness that you were exercising power without supervision by your peers. This is sort of like evading peer review, essentially, was amounted to.
So in other words, if they could quickly brush the issue or the incident under the rug, get it over with, etc.,
Right.
then there wouldn't be such an opportunity to expose it to more
Right.
review.
Yeah, sort of the
discussion.
concealment, sort of not so much covering up, but simply not announcing the exercise of power in such a way that, because they know that it's an abuse of power, so they don't announce it. And that's circumstantial evidence. And eventually, if you get enough patterns, repeated patterns, then it works its way up to higher levels and becomes exposed publicly. And the case that I was in, the perpetrators who were abusing power against me eventually did use their power against more prominent people. And it did go to the arbitration committee, and the leader he was unanimously convicted of abuse of power and making meritless accusations against people. He'd make a meritless accusation against people and then enact a punishment, a sanction based on a meritless and unproven accusation. And that was his habitual practice. And eventually he got caught up for doing it and got kicked off of Wikipedia.
So if this is the case, would your case not then be subject to review and your expulsion be repealed in some sense?
That was a big disappointment, because after this group that had been abusing of power were exposed, I said, now will you go back and correct all the mistakes? Because I wasn't the only victim of them. I was mine was kind of below radar. But I said, are you going to go back now and correct all of these misadventures, to use the euphemism? And the answer was, they just didn't. They didn't feel they had any ethical obligation to go back and correct the errors of the past once the pattern of errors became public. And so it never happened.
Okay.
That was a big disappointment.
So do you believe that that was because this is mostly a group of volunteers that are, in my understanding, not being paid to do this? Or is it that they really didn't care about what was fair?
Probably a mix of both. It would have been a lot of work to go back and find and correct all the cases. Would have taken a conscientious effort, and you can't get volunteers to do a conscientious effort. And the Wikimedia Foundation, which is really responsible, didn't have enough discipline to see to it that it was going to happen. So the Wikimedia Foundation didn't care that it wasn't being done, and the volunteers said, why should we bother? It's no fun. So there were maybe one or two administrators who had some ethics who thought we really should go back and fix things, but they just basically were in the tiny minority, and it never happened.
Okay, so, and again, in an effort to tie this to some current affairs, let's suppose that certain nominees for Supreme Court actually perjured themselves.
Right.
Let's suppose that that perjury has been widely exposed.
Yep.
Okay. Then would you not expect that the machinery, the government that has been invented in the Constitution would have some mechanism to go back and say, hey, these people were placed on the Supreme Court without following, quote unquote, the rules. They basically gamed the system. They essentially corrupted the system.
Right.
And therefore they're sitting on the Supreme Court in, how do I say it? English is not my native language. In an unjust manner, or whatever the words are, to say that it's invalid.
Yeah. Yeah. And the problem is that the senators who put them on the Supreme Court, because it's the senators who had vote for them, it's those same senators who would have to fix it. And they have to admit that because it's pretty obvious. I mean, to a naive observer, you could say, yeah, these guys are lying. And so the same senators who overlooked the lies would now have to go back and say, yeah, we knew, basically have to admit the guy was lying, and clearly we would have known it. So the problem is that you don't have a group of correctors who are not also the ones who made the mistakes in the first place, and therefore they are not inclined to do it.
Not only that, the elders or the village elders in this case are the Supreme Court that,
Right.
would be expected to rule on something like this.
Right. And this is why in the long run, and I say this is in the long run, people lose faith in the system. They see this evidence that the system isn't functioning in the ideal manner that it claims to be functioning in, and gradually it erodes trust in the system.
Okay, so I'm going to go out on a limb and express an opinion. Okay, let's see what you think of this one. I think the framers of the Constitution and most framers of most charters, in a sense, accept and believe and assume a basic decency in people.
Right.
We don't actually build in an assumption that people are not decent and then build all this machinery around protection against that. Now, that could have been naive, that could have been unwise, but it worked for over 200 years, it seemed. Although I didn't live then, so maybe incidents back then are viewed as badly as we view these incidents today. And I think there's evidence that that's been the case. But the population in general has certainly exploded, since 100 years ago. So, and technology has made these things much more visible.
Yep. I mean,
So
they did.
The question is basically, do we have to go back and revisit the assumptions on which these constitutions and charters were written? Or is there a way to just say, hey, that's an unwritten assumption that we as civil people need to hold as just accepted without written down? Both are dangerous positions, I think.
Yeah, axiomatic foundations and assumptions are fraught with danger of being incorrect, naively adopted, but turn out to be incorrect. And there are, I mean, even in mathematics, you go back and look at the axioms and you decide whether or not an axiom is justified or is overthrown. And there are systems where axioms and assumptions turn out to be inconsistent with other axioms, or they lead to paradoxes or conundrums. And then people, admit that there is this built-in paradox, like Gödel's theorem, for example, sort of shows a limitation. There was an assumption, unjustified assumption, that mathematics could prove every true theorem and disprove every incorrect hypothesis. Turned out not to be the case. And so there always are cases where you realize that the system is not as robust as you would have liked or imagined or presumed. And that's certainly true in legal systems and regulatory mechanisms. Even in feedback control theory, you have theorems that say, under these conditions, we can build a feedback control loop that will work. And here's conditions where you can't guarantee that you can build a functional feedback control system. It's sort of beyond the parameters. Go ahead, Sam.
Okay, so here I'm going to push on you a little bit, okay? Yes, it is possible to identify the limitations of mathematics based on its axioms foundations. I think that's clearly been shown multiple different ways. However, I think that's a far cry from saying, oh, well, therefore, because mathematics can't express everything true, let me now take this domain of human operations, i.e. the legal business, and say, therefore, we can just assume the same thing about that. I think that's a far cry. I think the whole structure of laws, regulations, legal, I mean, they have a long ways to go before they even approach the rigor and completeness of mathematics. Okay?
Yep.
So there's plenty of improvement possible without relying on that as a recourse. I think that's a danger.
You don't have
similar to the danger. Sorry, let me just say one more thing. It's similar to the danger of people saying, well, we discovered this about quantum physics. Therefore, now in interpersonal communications, everything is quantum. It's like, the most sloppy thinking you could possibly imagine. Okay. And I think people use that sort of thinking too readily, too easily as an excuse for not really working the issue and not really understanding what's going on. So let me push on you for that moment. I would say there's a lot you can do within the legal business or legal set of activities without having to say, oh, let's go back to our axioms. Now we can do that, but let's not also abandon the structure that's already there.
So yeah, so if you're aware of hard to recognize systemic flaws in formal systems, it's plausible to say, can I go back and look at less formal systems like social regulatory mechanisms and find similar deficiencies? But you don't need, I mean, that would be one reason to take a look. But in fact, you can find the deficiencies just from empirical evidence.
Much more readily.
More readily. So you don't need that as an excuse to look.
That's what I'm saying.
But there's sort of an apophenia. There is that, I get the feeling for it in formal systems, and I get the feeling for it in informal systems, and there's a sort of a similar sloppiness, as it were, or lack of rigor. Although the nature of the defects may be much more obvious in legal systems. So you have lawfare and other obstacles. There's a paper that came out, I think in the year 2000, by a professor at Harvard. I think he was in the psychology or medicine or psychiatry department. I forget exactly what. His name is James Gilligan. And he was studying, among other things, why there is violence in the culture. And he, among other things, he was at one time at one of the Massachusetts state hospitals where people were incarcerated because of psychiatric propensity towards violence. And so he was looking for the roots of violence. What is it that made these adults become violent? And he made a discovery from their backstories that they had certain patterns in their backstories. And in particular, he identified the cultural practice of shaming and blaming as being a prominent precursor of downstream violence in behavior. And another researcher who was counseling married couples in Silicon Valley also found that shaming and blaming within relationships of people who are intimate would lead to violent behavior within relationships. So they both independently, different scenarios. One is violence against strangers, the other one is violence against people that you're have a relationship with, and both of them found shaming and blaming to be a strong predictor or precursor of violence. But this professor from Harvard ended up writing a paper, which I think is very important, but very obscure. And in fact, I have a copy of it posted on my website. And he looks at violence in the agencies of government. Governments will basically use violence, whether it's in warfare or in the crime and punishment model. And he looks at the violence that is violence under the color of law, either punishment or warfare, where the use of violent treatment of people is considered lawful. And he looked at it both theoretically from his research and also historically from the history of governmental systems. And he wrote a paper in which he said, is the crime and punishment mechanism based on a huge mistake in thinking? That's not exactly the title, but it's basically what it says. And he argues that the adoption of the crime and punishment model was a bad idea. And he had the empirical evidence over 5 millennia, and also the research, in modern research in sociology and psychology and psychiatry and so on and so forth. Now, what's interesting is that his work is peer-reviewed science. But even in theology, the same observation appears in theology, where it was given the name, not humankind's original logic error, which is what I would call it. There was a theologian named Aquinas who called it original sin. Sin is just a word for mistake in Latin. So original sin was Aquinas's term of art for what Gilligan calls simply a huge mistake in the foundation of Western civilization, the adoption of the crime and punishment regulatory mechanism. And if you take the crime and punishment regulatory mechanism as a mechanism for regulating something, you say, would you ever apply it to technology? Would you ever regulate a piece of machinery by using the crime and punishment mechanism? So if I don't like my machine, I'm going to, beat on it. And you go, that's crazy. That's insane. You would never physically abuse a piece of hardware because it's misbehaving. You would diagnose it and find the cause and you would fix it. And yet with people, with humans, you still have this crime and punishment model. And even a century and a half ago, Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote a scathing caricature of the crime and punishment mechanism, showing it's dysfunctional in a novel, in a famous novel. And so there's lots and lots of evidence and lots of literature going all the way back to the earliest, oldest literature in human civilization, all the way up to modern scientific research that comes to the same conclusion, that this axiomatic foundation, this belief in law and order, that rules give you order, not chaos, is an axiomatic foundation. And in chaos theory, we discover just the opposite, that if you want to make a chaotic system on purpose, govern it by a set of rules. And the simplest example are board games. Board games have a small number of rules. You can memorize them, you can obey all the rules, and the gameplay, take a simple game like checkers or chess or Go or reverse side or any simple board game, there's an astronomical number of perfectly legal games of chess or checkers or Go governed by adherence to a small set of rules, and you cannot predict the outcome. The outcome of a game is any of astronomical number of perfectly legal games, and that is the definition of chaos. So you have that chaos theory mathematically overthrows the axiomatic belief in law and order. In fact, what's interesting, there's an NBC series that ran for 10 years called Law and Order. It was all about courtroom drama. This was on NBC and it's now on the TNT cable channel. And it's a drama, it's courtroom drama. And when it went into syndication on the Turner Network Television, TNT, their advertising slogan is, "We know drama." Drama and games are basically in instances of mathematical chaos because they're unpredictable. The outcome, the end of the game, the end of the story, or the end of the game is unpredictable. It's one of a set of an astronomical number of possible outcomes. So there it is in popular culture that Law and Order is really a drama, and drama is a special case of chaos. You don't get a predictable outcome.
I'm curious about that definition of chaos. I really am, because in addition to rules, which define games, there are strategies which are not in the rules.
Correct.
Right. So people derive these things.
Correct.
And strategies are usually associated with, values, either, values of board positions or, pawns.
Winning is the value.
Right.
You want to beat the other guy.
Right. So you, I think, could characterize, the astronomically exponential combination of possible games in some form of value dimension. Some are, better than others if you actually play these games.
Right.
And yet to say that because you cannot predict them, it's chaotic, seems kind of to me an incomplete definition. There's a lot of different ways these things.
It's evidence of chaos because one of the features of chaos is that it's unpredictable. It doesn't prove that it's chaotic, but it's gives you the reason to suspect, am I working with a mathematically chaotic system because of the fact that it's unpredictable? And the answer turns out to be yes.
Okay. So I would like to, this is really the question I was really hoping to dig into. This notion that rules and functions fundamentally have different behavior guidance characteristics.
Correct.
Okay. So the way I have been thinking about it till now is, as long as you point a direction, in other words, you characterize a desirable end state, and you leave it to the actors to see themselves how they could genuinely and authentically and good-heartedly try and get closer to that end state. I'm excluding the pathological ones for now, okay? But I'm just saying, if most people really say, hey, that's an acceptable and desirable end state, and I see the world differently than you see the world differently than Kayla, than Josh, et cetera, but we're each doing our best to get to that end state, then we could be following very, very different guidelines. Certain people could have very complex mathematical models based on functions. Other people could just be based on a very simple do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Everybody could have different models. And who are we to say, hey, this is wrong, this is right, as long as they each thought that we're working towards a commonly shared desirable end state. Now, ignore for the moment how that end state gets derived, okay? But just assume, for example, for purposes of this experiment, that could we allow a society where each one of us does the best they can towards this generalized notion of a good future? Over.
Yeah, so for example, I would like to live in a culture which minimizes the total amount of violence in the culture. I do not want an extremely violent culture. I do not want a culture which is rife with injustice. So my goal states are minimize violence, minimize injustice. But look at what's going on in the political. Lock her up, lock him up, okay? Or, send weapons to this country so they can throw rockets at that country. So you have state-sponsored violence, whether it's in the crime and punishment domain, or in the warfare domain, or in adolescents buying weapons and going into public venues and shooting up people in schools and shopping malls and movie theaters. And so you have this observable escalation of violence, both individual violence and state-sponsored violence. I don't want to see an escalation of violence either on the individual side or the state side. I don't want to see injustice, whether somebody stabs Salman Rushdie because there's a fatwa against him, or they convict the innocent guy and put him in jail and let the real perpetrator of the crime go free. I don't want to see that. So I want a system that minimizes violence, oppression, injustice, corruption, poverty, slavery, whatever. But most people will not list those as values that they want to adopt practices which promote. Very often you'll see people adopting values which increase the amount of violence, increase the amount of injustice. And I despair when I see that. It makes me very sad to see that our culture is drifting in the direction towards collapse, because that's not a sustainable cultural practice. So yeah, I have values which are not popular in terms of observable popularity.
Okay, so if Kayla and Josh want to say something, you're welcome to. I clearly always have a rejoinder. Josh.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about, I was watching a documentary on ancient India and a time when they had over 150 years of peace, and what was going on with the different religious sects and different cultures and different beliefs that they all could agree. And I think the concept of capitalism is the problem. And I thought about this a long time. Ever since my 20s, I was trying to integrate capitalism and Buddhism. Sorry if my mic is cutting out. To integrate bigger, better, more with no suffering, and understand that you're always going to want bigger, better, more. And how does that look like? And the only thing I can think of is the very definition of scarcity is rewritten to the allocation of abundant resources, as opposed to what it is now, the allocation of scarce resources. So I guess what I'm trying to say is with any system, if you adopt a culture of abundance, meaning everyone's welcome, anyone can come in, it's not a closed group, it can grow, it can join, it can be abundant and full, whether it be morals, values, or physical items like capitalism. There's so much to share, and everyone believes that. If that belief is there, is that a self-fulfilling prophecy, or is that just delusional because you can't allocate resources at large enough scales when it reaches a certain number? And that's what I'd like to really have a discussion on, is at which number does it become unmanageable? Is it 2,000 people? Is it 2 million people? Is it 200 million people? When does the amount of allocation and actual, what's the word I'm looking for? Latency, if you will, the ability to get those resources to the place in a timely manner where people feel it's abundant. No, it's in a silo somewhere, but if it's not on their plate, they don't give a shit. And that's where things start going awry and people take matters into their own hand. They don't believe it's coming. They don't believe it's going to be shared. Or why did he get to eat first? I'm in line for 5 hours. Why are they eating first? Like that kind of mentality of, I guess it's patience and abundance is what I'd like to bring into a conversation. And thanks for letting me get that out. I really love this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think what I
Unfairness
see-
and anger go together.
You
Say
say
that
that again,
again,
Barry?
Barry?
I missed
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Unfairness and anger go together. When you observe something that's unfair, it's commonplace to become angry. And when people are angry, they tend to do things rashly.
And would it not be the case that if you believed that these sort resources were abundant, then perhaps you would not care whether you had your apple 1 minute from now or 10 minutes from now. If you believed that there were abundant commons, then your impatience would be diminished, would it not? So long as you didn't have to wait till you died before you got it.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
So I think there's that inherent notion of, is there an abundant set of resources that we can all share? And is there a mechanism by which we all sort of get it fairly? And I think right there is the crux, because in capitalism, we do not trust the system to deliver us what we need fairly. In fact, what we trust in capitalism is that the most unethical, the most malicious, the most aggressive get their share, and in fact, my share also, and also your share.
Greed.
Greed. Yeah, as depicted in that movie Wall Street.
Right.
Right.
Greed is good. Yeah, that's the axiomatic foundation of corporatism. Greed is good.
And that movie was a precursor to understanding that Nash's assumption that we all act selfishly is a dangerous and obviously incorrect and clearly insufficient characterization of humanity.
Yeah. If you can hoard resources, you see, in the Marine mess hall, the mantra was take all that you want, eat all that you take. You don't hoard it. If you take it, you have to consume it. Okay. But in corporatism, you can take all that you want and hoard it and deprive others of it. And that's the problem. Taking more than you need and hoarding it, depriving others.
Justifying it so brilliantly with trickle down.
Yeah, but basically monopoly, like cornering the market on some resource so that they have to get it from you, and you can charge for insulin, you can charge $1,000 for a shot of insulin.
Trickle down does not apply to capital. Trickle down applies to urine, okay? You're being pissed on.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me get to my second question, Barry. The first question was, do you believe that we could actually all operate towards some kind of a shared common good? The second question really is, can we derive a description of shared common good? Those are both very important questions, right? It's part of this whole thing I learned many, many years ago. Okay, you used to think that the hardest thing in the world was how do you get what you want? But that ignores the harder problem of how do you know what you want?
You need get what you need, not what you want. You can want things you don't need.
Wait, you can assume that, but without really understanding and really asking that question, everybody has a very shallow notion of what that is.
Yeah.
very shallow.
Right.
Okay. So what I'm really thinking is if you really ask why, at least 5 whys, okay? Can we get to a shared common understanding of what we as a community want our future to look like? It's a difficult question because just as you say you don't want violence, I could, if I chose to, point to history and say, isn't that the way species have survived? They've basically been carnivorous. Would you characterize that as violence? One species on another. And was that not necessary for survival? Now you could say yes, or you could say no. But if you say yes, then the next question is, have we the ability to evolve beyond that?
If you obliterate your food supply, if you wipe out all the rabbits, the foxes are going to starve. So
right.
there's
this balance in the ecosystem that has
yes.
been very often characterized.
Yes.
You can look at wolves in Yosemite, for example, right?
Yeah.
You can understand this notion of eco-balance.
Exactly.
Now, is that still a violent situation? One could say yes.
Yeah, I suppose.
In fact, it would be hard to say no.
Yeah. So excess violence clearly is contraindicated.
Aha.
Whether or
So
not
how much is enough?
the minimum is enough. The minimum is enough. The minimum take the minimum nutrition that you need to survive, and don't take more than you need and waste it.
Okay, so let me ask you this. One time somebody tried to light a shoe on an airplane.
Yep.
Decades later, we spend billions, potentially trillions now, preventing people from lighting shoes on airplanes. In fact, I would argue, I don't know of another case where somebody tried to light a shoe on an airplane.
There hasn't been, to my knowledge.
Right. And yet, how many billions have been spent trying to prevent this thing?
Right.
Whereas, was that an effective way to do things? And was that social cost worth it? Could we have taken those billions and diminished suffering of hunger in some way?
Yep, absolutely.
Right?
Governments do not do the optimal thing. They often do things that are not only suboptimal, they're counterproductive.
But you could argue they were trying to minimize that form of violence. They were trying to do the right thing.
They didn't think it through, though. They didn't do the cost.
You could argue that.
Yeah.
You could argue that. Okay. But how often are things thought through? Really?
They're not. That's the problem. I mean, it's
people very rarely look at second and third and fourth, and certainly not fifth and sixth and seventh order effects.
Correct.
It's almost impossible in the legal system to do so. We don't have a sufficiently rich model of society to actually do that effectively.
If they did look at third and fourth order effects, they would discard the whole system and replace it by something much more functional.
Proof that it's not done.
Exactly. Exactly. Now,
Okay.
there are a few lawyers who become passionate about civil rights, but they're the tiny minority of lawyers basically say there's a problem with the legal system. We need to do something about civil rights, but they're not out there trying to win cases and put the other guy in jail. They're trying to prevent the excessive amount of injustice.
Yeah. So the reason I pose those questions as 1 and 2 is because I think there's a 3. Okay. Because I believe also that it's virtually impossible for a 7 billion person society to generally agree on what a generally accepted good vision of the future is.
Well, I'm sure that's right. I mean, it's hard enough to do in a small community.
Right. Hell, we can't even do it among 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 of us.
Yeah, that's your evidence that you can't do it
Right.
with more than 3 people.
So that's why I resort to share, make visible, and hold yourself accountable.
Yeah.
In other words, you could have a very different notion of what good means than Josh or Kayla or I do.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
As long as we're each trying to be as aligned intra-personally as possible. So that my beliefs, my values, my objectives, my mission, my actions, my habits, my to-dos all align along my notion of what good means.
Mhm.
And if I make myself accountable to myself, and you hold yourself accountable the same way, and Josh chooses yes or no, or Kayla chooses yes or no to hold themselves accountable the same way, and we share our teachings and learnings and our experiences with each other, then we can each learn. Maybe I can then say, hey, Barry, is violence really evil? And you could say yes, and you can convince me. Or I could say, look at history, and maybe I sort of get you to, adjust to that notion slightly. And if we actually take that responsibility to be accountable to ourselves, and then share those experiences and those teachings and learnings, then maybe we both benefit. And if we do this habitually, let's say every week, every 2 weeks, every month, quarter, year, whatever, eventually we will understand each other better in small little pods or cells or, groups of 3 or whatever it is that we choose to do this with.
Right.
That to me is the only way I can live my life. I'm not hoping that as a global society, we could ever get to everybody saying, okay, not killing is good, or providing food for everybody is good. You can clearly see by the actions of some, they don't care if others starve to death.
Right.
It's clear by their actions. So that's not a good that they would uphold themselves. Similarly, people in positions of power don't kill if innocent people are killed by missiles. They don't. They send those missiles.
Right. Yep.
So you're not going to get them to say, "Oh, these values are what I hold dear," and have that be in alignment with themselves. Profit is way more powerful than concern for other people's lives, it appears. But if we make all of this transparent, if certain people choose to make themselves accountable, let's say Cassidy Hutchinson or whatever her name was, she held herself accountable. She couldn't live with herself, I would believe, if she couldn't, do the right thing.
Right.
If a certain number of us do this and learn from each other, I think that I'm looking for is critical mass.
She bore accurate witness, and the most powerful thing a powerless person can do is bear accurate witness. The least powerful can still bear accurate witness.
That's the visibility, the transparency.
Right.
That I'm a strong supporter of.
Right.
Because without it, you make corruption possible.
Right.
And when corruption is possible, corruption happens.
Right. And by the way, bear accurate witness is part of the fundamental theorem of feedback control theory. The observer in a feedback system must bear accurate witness to the true state of the system, or it feeds incorrect information to the controller, who then turns the steering wheel the wrong direction. Right. So bearing accurate witness is not only a fundamental concept of theology, it's a fundamental concept of the mathematics of cybernetics.
That's only half of it. Not only do you have to bear accurate witness, you have to bear accurate witness within the right time frame.
Yeah, timely.
If the feedback comes back too late, you still can't turn the steering wheel.
Right, timely. Yeah, bear accurate witness timely, within the
feedback loop.
Yeah, within the frequency. Who's kind of forgetting the name of the of the theoretician who has the sampling theorem.
Yeah, it's got to be within that dampening period. So, yeah,
Josh
I want to say something.
Oh, I was just going to add on to that what you guys both said: the bear accurate witness, timing, and then also maintenance of the system at certain intervals. So random maintenance of the system, not just scheduled, because it can break in between.
Right. I mean, the ideal transparency is continuous transparency.
Yes.
It's not just spot transparency. Although I have myself come up with a notion that I still think is useful, which is eventual transparency. Certain parts of people's lives, they would rather keep private. And I understand that. But for purposes of accountability, if you knew that it was eventually possible to make that transparent, when it became necessary, let's say under, full scrutiny because something bad happened, then I think that's a useful concept.
Yeah.
But I still think that in most cases, continuous transparency is still preferred.
Yeah. Harry Nyquist, he was the one who said you have to bear accurate witness within the Nyquist sampling interval, or else it's too late.
But depending on the control mechanisms, you could actually adjust your trim tabs within this subsystem, or you could adjust your trim tabs in this other larger subsystem, or you could actually do it, somewhere else. So there's a whole
There are layers.
verisimilitude notion about where you make these adjustments.
Yes, yeah.
So Barry, that's the conversation I'd really like to explore with you, because it was still, in my opinion, I still don't yet understand the case you make for rule-based systems being unstable. If
Well-
these rules, these primitive guidance systems, in fact, you could say heuristics even, not just rules, are sufficient for people to adjust their behavior along some path that is good, would that not be sufficient? Because people do this all the time. There's about 7 billion people in the world, and I venture to say most of them are not thinking systemically. They're operating on heuristics and simple rules of thumb that they've learned from their community or from their parents or from trauma. And that's what's guiding their behavior. And we can't say that that's insufficient in the general sense, because otherwise we'd be saying this is impossible.
The main problem with rules is they tend to be discrete two-state systems. So you divide the spectrum of states into just two binary states. And on this side, you do one thing. And on that side, you do something dramatically different. And there's a switch between the two states, as opposed to a nice, gentle, differentiable curve that transitions. And so the difference between this rule, on this side do that, and on this side do that, as opposed to do that, that's a huge mathematical difference. This is how you build a feedback control system that's graceful and stable and reliable. And this is a way to make one that's herky-jerky and unstable and erratic.
Can I give you an example?
Sure.
Suppose I gave you a rule. If you have a choice between being mean or being kind, be kind.
Yep. But there's degrees.
Now wait,
It's not
that's,
binary.
that's clearly stated in binary form,
Yes, it is.
okay?
It is.
So if we gave this to everybody in the world and everybody accepted it and saying, yes, I will do this, okay? Now, you're saying that that's still a rule-based system and that will be unstable and produce chaos.
Because people will have to make a judgment about what do they understand as being mean and what do they understand as being kind. So for example, if you make a mistake and I correct you, maybe in public, maybe not in public, but if I correct you, is that being kind? In the short term, I might be embarrassing you. That's unkind. In the long term, I'm saving you from making that same mistake in the future where it could be very dangerous. So the notion of kind and mean is fuzzy. And you might not have a sharp boundary that everybody agrees this is the boundary between kind and mean, because it sort of depends on the scale of time and consequences of doing or not doing something.
I accept what you say. However, if 7 billion people still accepted that, and they were still trying to do the kindness bit wherever possible, would that still be insufficient, really? In other words, I don't expect a monotonic approach to, utopia. I expect a non-monotonic approach.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Absolutely non-monotonic. We tend to learn in these roller coaster wiggles. We try stuff and it turns out to be ill-conceived and we'll drop some element that's problematic and then replace it by something else. So the growth curve isn't monotonic. Growth curve tends to be kind of a roller coastery thing because we try things and then discard them as being suboptimal. Or
but the
having
one
flaws
thing
in
I'm pushing on is this simplification of binary rules being chaotic just by their very nature.
Well, they're not guaranteed to be chaotic, but they often are.
Okay, that I accept, but I heard you differently up till now.
Yeah.
Josh,
For example, in my house, my furnace either turns on 100% or turns off 100%. Now, you can have an oven that maintains a much more stable. It doesn't wait and turns on and then turns off. So the square wave on off is less stable. It's going to generate a sawtooth. Whereas if you don't want a sawtooth, if you want stable, then you have something that's continuous. And it depends on whether
charred meat or raw, Barry.
And do you want it cooked on the outside or raw on the inside? So you have all these parameters, which, can you live with a sawtooth temperature in your house? If the sawtooth is only plus or minus 1 or 2 degrees, maybe okay. But if you're doing something, that needs more precision than that, then you don't want to turn the fires on, turn the fires off. You want something that's got a rheostat on it that's adjusted.
Okay, but I think you get my point, which is that the simplification of rule-based systems, I think, is too general.
Yeah.
Josh.
Yeah, I think you guys have kind of nailed it because it's a timing issue. So we're talking about turning a system on and off switches, routers, things switching. If it's an abrupt switch, that's fine for some people.
Mhm.
So if I went, hey, I fucking hate you, I'm gonna kick your ass outside. And then Sam walks over and goes, hey, we have to be kind. And I go, oh, I'm sorry, I'll give you time to train. Let me give you a couple months and we'll fight in 3 months. You know, it's funny because timing is everything. And I think what it comes down to is each individual soul on this planet, not to get too philosophical or spiritual or anything, but each person has a different, it could be a millisecond of comprehension timing, of what is needed in speech if we slow it down, or if we're in New York and we talk really fast and people are like, I don't understand what you're saying, you're talking really too fast. The timing aspect of a system has to calibrate to the user of that system. And I think that's the feedback loop I'd like to get, is to know that certain systems work for certain groups of people that are set at a certain speed of timing. Does that make sense?
In near term and far term, what do you want, a near term payoff or a long term payoff? Yeah, timing is a big factor, and people won't agree on, you know, how long is long enough to wait to get something.
Or if you look at the analogy of an optometrist that's switching 1 or 2
Right.
or 3, 1 or 2, some sort of calibration, an individual personalized calibration to onboard someone to a rule-based system so that those rules can effectively work for that person separately, meaning maybe I want a 3-second fight rule in my system. So I can fight or flight in 3 seconds and figure that out, whereas someone needs a 24-hour cooldown period.
Yeah.
And just setting the rules personalized. And I think that's where I've always come to blows or come to heads with people trying to set up systems, is I'm under the big belief that not only is everyone individual, but each moment in time changes that individual need dependent on how they woke up or what happened. So everything is very timing based in that moment. So if we could build a rule-based system that could recalibrate instantaneously in the moment, then, and the only system I know that someone's trying to do that is the self-driving cars at Tesla at the Tesla company. They're trying to calibrate multiple thousands of point decision-making in milliseconds. And that type of timing that they're doing, no one's ever tried to do things at that type of speed.
Yep.
And that's really fast.
Yeah.
To have a system drive a car, a computer drive a car, that's, you know, we're doing thousands and thousands of computations in under half a second when we're driving a car as a human. So to try to recalibrate that, I think that is just the precursor to the amount of systems we could create if we can get that working at some sort of agreeable level, that it's good enough. I think that what they're trying to do 4 times better than a human. So if it's doing it 4 times better, it's not perfect than the average human, because some people are race car drivers, you know. And I guess what I'm trying to say is with any system, there needs to be some sort of rule that says this works for 99.8% of the people, but for the 0.2%, it can be recalibrated for those. And I think that's what's important, is to have something that doesn't, like Doug always says, you know, don't leave anyone behind. It's all of us or none of us. But if you make a rule-based system where the 0.2% that gets thrown to the side, that creates a huge problem and chaos 100 years down the line for the whole system, if it accounted for those 0.2 and they didn't turn into the monkey wrench that broke the machine over time. In other words, if there's a system that works for 100% of everything by constantly recalibrating, that is the system I'd like to be in. I hope that's clear.
Yeah. Sam.
So I get the idea behind that. But again, I think this is a risk management, risk profile kind of question. Like that, you know, whole TSA thing with lighting shoes.
Right.
So I think, you know, just in driving, for example, we know there's a certain number of deaths encountered on the roads every year. And yet we don't seem to bat an eye. We seem to think that the system works. Okay. We don't say, oh, take everybody off the streets because somebody died yesterday in a car accident. That would be extreme, right? So there's a balance of risks, and there's a risk profile that we as society or we as politicians decide is acceptable, or we as insurance companies decide is acceptable.
Right.
And we're willing, in a sense, to live with that number of deaths rather than saying, no, we've got to drive it down to zero. Driving it down to zero would create draconian processes in society. And I don't think any of us are prepared to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. On the other hand, if it went up 10x, yeah, that would also get everybody kind of working. On the other hand, that thinking doesn't seem to apply to shootings. We seem to be quite comfortable with it, with any number of deaths in schools.
Yeah.
We meaning the Republicans.
Yeah.
So
Do you mind if I just point something out, Sam?
Yeah.
Your thinking is absolutely logical. It makes perfect sense, but that's the thinking of casualties in war. When you said earlier in the conversation, we don't care about those innocent people that die. We do care about it. We just did a risk management and said 8,000 versus 7 billion or 7.8 billion. That's manageable risk. We can handle the 8,000. If it gets up to 30,000, that might create a caliphate or might create a big, an uprising. Like that kind of risk management is what the Central Intelligence Agency was built for, because they can only operate on foreign soil. So they want to operate the amount of risk management towards who will be a threat to the United States of America. And then the FBI handles the internal risk management. But all those type of thinkings, we've thought about all these things quite a bit. I just want to say it's not like they're horrible people. They just have their calibration set at a different level than the average human being, because anyone would say zero.
Yeah, right. Which is my point, which is that everybody has different levels at which they find that to be either abhorrent or acceptable. Everybody has a different setting. That's why I think it's impossible to say, okay, here is how we set general guidance across society.
Classic example, 3,000 people died when the Twin Towers fell on 9/11. Every 3 days in America, 3,000 people die of gunfire. Every 3 days, year after year.
Or of COVID at one point.
Yep. So, you can see that people really, the general public basically doesn't do math, it doesn't do probability. They don't reckon probability the way that would make sense if you were doing it in some kind of a rational fashion. And I don't know the solution to that problem except education. Can you really educate the people to be able to do math on a consistent basis? I don't know. So far, the answer has been no.
You can try. You can try.
You can try.
The only thing worse than saying it's not working is to not try.
Yeah, and we try. And
Andrew Yang is the math president. He tried. He ran on that platform. I'm the math guy. I'm going to do PowerPoint at the State of the Union address. He ran on that platform. He really did. Like someone tried.
And people don't like it.
Oh, exactly.
Okay, people don't understand and value that. We'd rather vote in a crook who grabs women by the pussy than grab somebody who thinks, in a systemic way.
At this moment in time, because we were conditioned through reality television to look through a tube, a little screen in our house, and watch life and think that that was real life because it's called reality TV. When if anyone lifted up the veil and went behind the scenes on a reality TV set and watched it all scripted and watched them get drunk and watch the producers push the chaos to a point where grab them by the pussy and all of that is acceptable behavior on any reality show, you'll always see somebody disrespecting women or disrespecting each other or fighting or something like that. Those are condition-based systems that were set up for that. Whereas if you walk down the street in general in any city, I don't care how violent it is, you will rarely see that. On a day-to-day basis, the amount of violence that you see on television, you will not see that in real life. I beg anyone to do that in very few places.
The consumption of those shows drives the production of them. And it's been going on, 20, 30 years now?
And one of the most popular shows of all of those shows was the gentleman, I forgot his name, but he produced all of those reality shows from the real world. And he produced Donald Trump's show. And Donald Trump learned and tested. His experiment was to see if he could fire people on national television and judge who was worthy to be in his organization and take that all the way to the top organization in the world, which is the president of the United States. So it was a plan of his to see if he could use the tactics from that show in the media and say, no, you're a liar. That person did a great job. You're fired. And that's how he ran that show, is he would say to the other person that told the truth about the person not doing what they did, he believed the person that he wanted to believe. And he ran our government the exact same way. Betsy DeVos, or all these people that he put into, who was the guy in charge of the housing and urban development. I mean, it's literally running a government the way a reality TV show is ran. And that's why we're all disgusted, is because that's not looking out for the greater good of each other. It's lying and cheating and horrible. And we're all up in arms at that. We don't want that again. Like that's not the lifestyle we want to lead. Even if we believe it's happening at some level, it's another thing to have it blatantly thrown in our face.
But
Yeah, I'm going to say something here because I've
Kayla.
wanted to say it before both of you started ranting. The whole thing
late,
about we
Kayla.
don't see it anymore is completely incorrect. As a woman, we see it in a different platform. We may not see it so much in reality TV, but we still see misogyny. This is still a very patriarchal society where the entitlement of men are actually just coming to the forefront. And it's actually becoming a little bit more, because I feel like the entitled men are losing their shit because this is becoming more towards the forefront. So I just wanted to add that little bit of it, but continue.
No, I think that needs to be expanded upon. I think the whole point is that it's been so suppressed for so long that even that opinion has not been possible to express up until recently, it seems, or nobody was listening.
Yep. You
And
know,
just to signal, sorry, Kayla, I'm gonna be listening, but I gotta take them down to the breakfast thing because it closes in 20 minutes. I'll be listening. I'll hear. I just didn't want to. You think that I just logged off, Kayla? Go ahead.
It's okay. Yeah. It's it's still very much a patriarchal society. You still see it, and you know, we women are feeling it, the pressures of it now, especially since we're beginning to use our voice. Most of us, at least, most of us are starting to say, "Hey, this is wrong," you know. And all this time, all of the things that, you know, speaking for most women here, we typically don't like a lot of violence. We don't like that. We don't like that entitlement. We think it's unfair. We think it's awful. And it's, you know, due in fact to the patriarchal society. I'm sorry. You know, it's how many hundreds of thousands of men go into warfare? You know, how many of them feel like they have to defend women from what? Other men? It's just, I think, you know, it's not happened because of reality TV. Reality TV was a platform to show it, but it's happening now, and it's happened thousands of years ago.
How could we get the message out in a more effective way? Could we help?
Yeah, I think more men should hold other men accountable, because it sounds like men listen to other men. I think a lot, again, I think a lot of this is coming to the forefront because it's been a patriarchal society. I think the more people start to kind of rise against this whole thing about gun violence, the more it just gets pushed back. You know, I don't know the answer or the mathematical equation except to continue doing what we're doing until we can find something better. So yeah, I think more men should call each other out. More men should, you know, more families should be involved so that their little boys don't fall trapped to Andrew Tate. You know, definitely education. I think education is the key, and everyone needs to be involved.
I'm a huge fan of education. I've spent quite a number of years in promoting STEM education, but I also observe that STEM education is hard. There's a lot of people who just, for whatever reason, are not very adept at learning the elements of STEM education, no matter how we try. Go ahead, Sam.
Kayla, may I clarify? You're not addressing STEM education. You're addressing the misogyny practices and habits and culture that are just basically throughout society and not available for commentary / criticism up till now. Is that right? Because I was wondering whether that whole point about STEM was related or was kind of a little bit off the mark. And I apologize, Barry, for interrupting.
Yeah, it's a little bit off the mark, but that's okay. I appreciate that, especially as somebody who has a hard time with STEM education. And I think it's just because people don't try it and they're fearful of it. And you can also correlate that to what I discussed about misogyny and the patriarchal society. I think just people are just afraid and they don't want to lose their power. They think that, you know, things will go bad if you do things a certain way. It's just, you know, kind of like as a parent, what's the worst you can do? I used to think that if I didn't overpower my children, or if the children didn't do what I said, they have to do what I said, because the worst thing that could happen is they'd be like, fuck you, mom. You know, that in my head was like the worst thing that could happen. And I thought about it like, if that's the worst thing that can happen, I mean, I should be grateful, because, you know, the worst thing that can happen really is my children dying or something awful, like something much, much worse than that, being raised as an asshole or, committing suicide. I think people just are afraid of trying something new, of being accountable. They're afraid they're going to be humiliated once you're accountable, because that is unfortunately the old school way of doing things. Shame somebody, you were wrong. Yeah, you were wrong. But if you're making the steps to right something, then let's just acknowledge that you're wrong and move forward, not shame somebody for it. So I don't know. With the STEM correlation, I love it because it just reroutes my mind, because I can go down this, rabbit hole with a whole misogyny thing. Sam knows that. I've been forwarding videos to you almost on a daily basis. But yeah, it's time to try something new. Go STEM.
I think if we had really, really good STEM education that took hold, that we would supplant the rule of law with a much more functional regulatory mechanism. And we would have done it a long time ago. The fact that we can and haven't sort of is evidence that our STEM education sucks for the general public.
Goes back to systems thinking.
Right, systems thinking. Because you can't get to systems thinking without a good foundation of the elements of the STEM subjects, which I think is why we don't have very many systems thinkers in public life and in government. We have a few, count them on the fingers of one hand.
So Barry, I do agree with, sorry, Taylor, go.
Oh, no, it's okay. Go ahead.
Okay,
or
so
you want
quickly,
me to
go ahead. Yeah, go.
Who had systems thinking, with probably knowing he had systems thinking, is that white supremacist, the son of the white supremacist, last name is Black. Oh, I forgot. There was a wonderful article on him. He was basically groomed and raised to be the next, leader of the KKK. And he actually discovered that everything that was fed to him was a complete lie. And it was through science, through systems thinking that he discovered on his own that, it was just ignorance, blatant ignorance. All of these crazy things that were fed to him. So that's it. I'm done.
I'd like to find out more about this guy.
Yeah, I don't recognize the surname Black as being anybody from that genre. There was that guy from Louisiana whose name I'm forgetting, but he was sort of the.
You're not talking about David Duke, are you?
Yes, yeah, David
Duke's son, right?
David Duke's son's name is Black.
No, the last name, not David Duke. Maybe that is his nephew.
Oh, okay, I could believe that. Yeah, David Duke was the one who conceivably a later generation would have rejected David Duke's philosophy.
So Barry, I do agree with you about, needing change in STEM education, making it more effective, but I think that would still take quite a while to effect. And in the meantime, there's this notion of, first stop the bleeding, right? First, stop the harm.
Yeah.
And we need to take steps that are more tactical.
Yeah, and I'm kind of at a loss for that. I mean, the things that I've understood and tried haven't been terribly effective. I wouldn't say they're totally ineffective, but they really haven't budged the needle very much.
But I think what Kayla and others are saying is we shouldn't have to come up with those. We should be more listening to Kayla and her sisters and other women. They have suggestions. We've been the ones that come up with suggestions for decades and millennia.
I'll give Kayla credit for raising a couple of fabulous youngsters. I mean, that's something that I didn't have the opportunity to do, at least on a daily basis for, 1 or 2 decades.
So what I'm hearing is we should be listening more and then taking action and incorporating that rather than saying, well, let's recognize the problem and then we solve it. I don't think that's the suggestion here.
But certainly recognizing, admitting, identifying, naming the problem is half of the battle. And at least
we've been naming it wrong. See, I don't think we're acknowledging that women are naming the problem the way they see it.
Oh, how if they are?
In other words, we should talk less.
Oh, I wouldn't disagree with that.
Well, since we're talking about we were talking about animal instincts. One of the things that I love is watching documentaries about people who kind of live with the wolves or live with the bears or something, or become one of the gorillas. It's definitely a kinder process is to just hang out with the animals to really get to know them and educate them. I'm not saying women are animals, but there's nothing gay about hanging out with a bunch of women. It's not going to make you gay. And that's another thing that I think a lot of heterosexual men are afraid of. They're like, oh, we don't want to be feminine. And that's one thing that I love about the youth coming up is they're starting to break those barriers and say, well, there's nothing wrong with, having a purse or trying on makeup. In YouTube, there's a man who puts on makeup. And he's very manly. He's actually very attractive. And even with his makeup and everything, it's just, I love the people who can embrace that and chill with us for a little bit and not be so put off by it. Because I was one of the girls who was one of the guys, in my 20s. I used to hang out with the Samoan and Tongan guys. I mean, talk about like a group of manly men, and so I don't have this fear of the manly men. What I do have this fear of is my voice being shut down, or discarded or discounted. It just kind of like Drew Afualo, I think I sent that to you, Sam, where she said that misandry is just kind of something made up. I mean, what's misandry going to do? It's going to hurt guys' feelings, and correct me if I'm wrong. It hurts men's feelings at the end, blah, blah, blah. But misogyny is like a system of oppression. It oppresses the voice of women. And she's a bit extreme, but in the end of this video that I should send to you too, Barry. In the very end, she says, well, what's the worst that's going to happen with misandry? A few feelings hurt, accounts like deleted. What's the worst that can happen in misogyny? I don't know, murder. That's the system that, I think promotes violence, and stops evolutionary thinking. And, it doesn't promote systemic thinking at all. And that's where we start to have this like very basic instinctual fighting amongst each other, if I'm making any sense whatsoever.
So where should men be listening? What communities? Other than the blogs and TikToks that you're sending me, where else should we be?
Hey, the blondes.
What?
No, just I don't
Wait,
know.
I didn't say blondes.
You didn't?
No, I said blogs.
Blonde.
Oh, okay. You said blonde.
Nora Bateson for one.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Fabulous.
Yes. Listen to Gail.
Kirsty
She would-
Bellman. Probably most of you, well, Sam probably knows who Kirsty Bellman is, but her name may not be familiar to the general public.
Wait, who?
Kirsty Bellman, the daughter of Richard Bellman,
No, I don't know her.
and to a lesser extent, Esther Dyson, the
I know
daughter
her.
of, what's Dyson's first name? I'm forgetting now.
No, Dyson has a very good TED talk. I really enjoyed her talk
Yeah.
there. But Kayla, do you feel you've got a forum either with other friends or people you get with on a regular basis that then can voice these opinions and then be heard?
I personally don't have a forum. A lot of my friends are like more older. And it's kind of like an everyday thing. It's just amazing how there are so many stories that are similar, and I'm happy to share it because now it bothers me, but it doesn't bother me so much. A lot of us have these similar situations where we're pinched, our asses were pinched at bars, boobs grabbed, just like blatant disrespect of our bodies in general. I mean, when I was like a little girl, like I don't even know, I think I was 10. I think I was one digit. I was molested by a teenager. A teenager couldn't have been like a kid himself, and then later on by my uncle. So that was fun. And geez, it's just like countless everyday thing. I mean, just recently at my uncle's prayer, my cousin asked, he's like, "Oh, please, do you not miss all of that attention from men?" I was all, hell yeah, I don't fucking miss it. Hell no. Like, I'm happy that I'm not as attractive as I was when I was in my 20s and 30s to that group of men, because now I could just walk freely and be myself. No one's going to pinch my ass and stare at me. I'm not going to have some fool ask me for my fucking phone number or somebody curse me out because I don't want to date them. It's just, so yeah, I don't have that type of a forum because my girlfriends and I were just over it. So we listen to other women and we support them, but you can find them everywhere. There's a lot of women, and check out the comments too. I mean, there's still a lot of harassment online, especially, and in secret. I know there's like some secret male societies that like to, promote this kind of stuff, but whatever suits you, Sam. I would start with Gail.
One of the things she feels politically incorrect to say when there's so much in the media about groups that are being oppressed is she keeps saying, why aren't women being identified and talked about? Because women are half of society. She's not diminishing what is happening to other groups, but we seem to, be ignoring this oppression of half of society.
Yeah, because there's still in other people's minds that it's not worthy of bringing up. There's another TikTok that I'll send to you where this very educational gentleman called Danell, he's this Black guy. He normally has a forum for church and Black oppression, but he posted something that was very eloquent about it, about this gentleman who seriously could not believe that, I guess, okay, I'll back up. So it was two guys talking to each other. One of them says, how come women don't make sandwiches and lunches for their man anymore? And the guy, the other person he was talking to said, it's because they're tired. And the guy was like speechless. He's like, they got to go to work. They're tired. They don't want to make sandwiches. They don't want to make dinner. And the guy was like, wait, what? And you could just see the disbelief in his face. And then he's all, dude, don't you know, isn't there like a hierarchy in your household? And he was like, no, we both work. If we can get to it, one of us will. It's a partnership. And the man's face was just so surprised and shocked. He was like, do you not know? It was just two conflicting viewpoints, fully in belief of themselves. And, to compare the both was to say, yeah, one's a lot more fruitful than the other. One's a lot more evolving than the other, and there's a whole bunch of people in society that still cannot grasp that part of evolution that has sprung forward. They're still in that crazy ass mindset. And so that's why, half of the population doesn't have a voice. Sorry, I don't mean to gloom and doom everything.
No, I'm just thinking.
Oh, I feel so bad. Did I carry the conversation like a different direction?
It's an important one.
Aw.
We've certainly done our part in GCC to drive women away, other than you and Stacy.
I do know some women that will be happy to talk, but
Invite them in.
nailing. Go ahead.
Invite them in.
Yeah, it's just nailing down their schedule. This is kind of an nothing to be demeaning, but it definitely is, like you said, Sam, an entitled thing to do, to sit and talk. So if some of my friends have some time, I'll make sure that they come on in.
Hey, even if it's not 8 o'clock on a weekend, if there's a time that's better for them, we can still do it.
Yeah. I have lots of time. I'm retired, so most days of the week I've got plenty of free slots. It doesn't have to be, Saturday or Sunday morning.
I could try this again, like a Talanoa type.
Sure, absolutely.
Well, not necessarily a Talanoa, I think.
Whatever. Yeah. Coffee clutch, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. How would you guys like to talk to my dance group?
That'd be fun.
I could start there.
If they're interested, by all means.
Yeah.
Yeah, structure it however you think would be most effective. Whether we just listen or whether, you're moderating, whether or not, it's all women, whatever.
What would be cool too is invite one of the cultural educators in Tahiti one woman in particular, I'm trying to get close to her because she's awesome and I totally love her. She is the like basically a cultural educator, and she has these extremely helpful videos that are kind of expensive though, that people can purchase to learn more about the Tahitian culture. She's also very fun, and I just love her energy and the way she talks. So maybe I can invite her if I start to hype it up and name drop, which I still should. You guys might, the bio that I wrote for myself, it sounds really good.
Do you want to drop her name?
Her name is Hinatea Colombani.
And how you spell it?
Let me see, where's my phone?
I can get it from you later if you like.
Hinatea Colombani is awesome.
If I search
Very
for
good.
her, am I likely to hit her?
Hinatea Colombani?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, and I just talked to one of my capoeira sisters. She is in charge of this ritualistic moon festival that she'll be doing in September. She's going to the pyramids in Mexico, Teotihuacan, and she's going to do, I don't know if it's going to be a full-on temazcal, where it's the sweat lodge spirituality thing. It's like 4 days of dancing and sweating in honor of the moon. Sounds very interesting, but it's supposed to be very spiritual. She's into Ayurveda and stuff. And she's pretty badass in capoeira. But she's another one that promotes, she's more of a promoter of women, you know, and their sexuality and spirituality. I can always ask her.
I think it's a very important area for exploration. I certainly can learn a lot.
Well, if you guys are ever into watching Netflix, there is this thing about Woodstock 99, and it's really interesting because it talks about the destruction of that event. But what really got me was the disrespect for some of the women there. I mean, they didn't dive into it, but I grew up with the idea that if you flaunt your body, of course, you're going to start inviting unwanted advances. And the women in Woodstock 99, most of them freely took off their top. Now, in most areas in the world, you can go topless on the beach. And just having been like to Tahiti, for instance, and seeing women of all shapes, sizes, and ages with their tops off, and nobody is gawking at them. Like, it's an empowering, liberating, wonderful, beautiful thing. And so a lot of these women freely took their top off because of, you know, their beliefs and whatnot. But you could see as the crowd started getting violent and people started getting drunk and out of control, there was a lot of groping and sexual advances to these women, and they were vastly outnumbered. Not to mention, at the end of the show, spoiler alert, there were a couple of women who had spoken out and said that they were raped. So, you know, it's really sad. And again, it's just, it comes back to that really strange, violent, you know, entitlement. And I don't know what it is.
How about you have to cover yourself because I can't control myself?
Yeah. No.
Say goodbye. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Josh.
Thank you, Kayla. And sometime I would love to share with you the book Sapiens, talking about why men listen to other men and why they're all like the way that they are. Because men are weird creatures. We believe each other, and then the women thing, it's a whole. Anyway, I'd love to share that and have that conversation sometime and go deeper on the subject, because it's an important subject
All right, sounds
with everybody.
good.
Yep, how we believe each other. So thank you for sharing. Cheers.
Hopefully I won't be triggered.
No, it's always surprising
It's
to
a
me every
book?
single time. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, tell me.
The puritanical roots of this country go very deep.
And that started right here in New England.
We're so afraid of sexuality. We're so afraid of women.
You know, they had the witch hunts right not so far from where I live in Salem, the other side of the metropolitan Boston area.
And even though other cultures were not this way and they celebrated, the relationships that men and women can have, even in this society, it's only been recently that even women's orgasms were acknowledged as not a form of hysteria.
Even the word hysteria, which
I
was
know.
coined by what
I
Freud.
know.
I think Freud coined that term, didn't he?
And there was a treatment for it.
Hysterectomy.
No. That's why, by the way, I really am much more curious about ways of living and systems of thought, like the ancient Taoists or even the tantrists, who really accept humanity, and I don't mean that in a misogynistic, just our basic natures, not something to be afraid of. But often that's politically incorrect also. That's how deep these puritanical thoughts are. So Kayla, I would very much be curious to see if you would start a forum which could then be more expressive in its power, and you feel more effective in getting the word out, the opinions out, or maybe you just feel that we just don't need another one. We just need to listen to all the ones that currently exist. I don't know, but that's one that Gail and I do have many conversations on.
I am not afraid to try it. I just don't guarantee it. I'm not afraid to try it. It'd be awesome if I could get some of my favorite people to be online, or friends and dancers, and just have these discussions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Listen to a different group of people.
You structure how you think it ought to be best. Whether men are participating, or whether men just listen, or whether men are not even present, and we just do it on the recording. However you feel is most effective.
One of the best talks I ever gave was at a professional society of teachers. And although I had slides, all I did was ask questions of the audience, and the audience's response constructed the entire content of the talk.
It would also be a good idea to ask women who support the patriarchal society, to be a part of it. It'd be nice to ask, like, why would you, what is happening in your household? What happened in your household? Why, why do you feel the need to do this? Yeah, because there are a lot of women who still support that too. Their voices are few and far between, but they're still there. And the one thing that I love about some of the content creators who are about women's rights is that they will never bash, like, well, they'll say something about that said woman, but they will always keep it anonymous who that person is until somebody else finds out, of course. But I kind of like that. It's kind of like a sisterhood, it's like, hey, we're going to call you out, but we're going to protect your identity because we know you're always going to be oppressed some way or another. That's the way I see it.
I would listen.
Yeah, it would be kind of nice to, like, give those women a voice too, and just see where you're coming from and not have it be so one-sided. It just makes for an interesting conversation.
So no urgency, but let me know if I can help you make this thing happen.
Yeah, well, tell Gail to come on.
She will.
I'll put out some dates.
So Barry, I'm not sure this went according to your expectations. And if not, then we can certainly continue this in a different form. But I do like the topics that we've touched on today.
Yeah, I mean, we can go a lot deeper. I have enough material accumulated over 35 years that would be maybe more than a semester's worth of graduate level content, maybe even a full 2 semesters worth. And it's unlikely that anybody really wants to sit through a semester's worth of material in these Sunday morning sessions. But yes, I have a lot of material that may not be the only source on the planet, but it's it's rarely addressed material. A lot of it's graduate level, so that by definition is rarely addressed by the general public.
Okay, so whether or not I've been able to do it either crudely or in some way effectively, I'm trying to draw some connections between what you've been thinking and writing about with, what we're currently facing today. And so in a small way, I'm trying to bring that into context as well.
Well, I mean, the problems that I address, systemic problems in our culture, arise at all levels, from the family level up to the global level. And these systemic problems, and I occasionally recited a list of a dozen of them, they're ubiquitous. They've been with us since the dawn of civilization, and they all have something in common. And what they have in common is that you can apply systems thinking to address them. They have a common kind of pattern to them. They're recursive. They influence each other, that if you try to adjust one of them, it influences the others. And you really have to apply a systems thinking approach to solve them ensemble, because you can't solve them individually. If you fix one of them, basically the problem pops up in one of the other 11 of the dozen, or one or more of the other 11. Mm-hmm. It's your basic whack-a-mole. The classical model is like whack-a-mole.
Yep. Whack-a-mole is not a problem.
Well, it's a puzzle.
It's a natural perception of the way things evolve.
Yeah, and it's a very nice model, because you punch it down here and it pops up over there. And that's a lot of our systemic problems have this whack-a-mole dynamics. You just move the problem from here to there.
Well,
this domain to that domain.
Let's see what women want to whack. Sorry, did I say that?
That's a little suggestive, but okay.
I did not mean that in the way. I did not mean that in the way it came across. Really, I realized it halfway through saying it. Sorry.
Too late.
Sorry. My apologies.
Yeah, I mean, oppression and injustice. Those are two of the names of two of the moles. So yeah. Abuse, oppression, injustice, abuse.
Trying to be supportive and not politically incorrect.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else before we close? I mean, it's already been 2 hours, and
Yeah.
I want to support whatever Kayla wants to create. And Barry, I want to continue where you felt we've not concluded, but I really do.
Well, we can do this as often and for as long as necessary until you're saturated or you think we're kind of running out of steam.
What I'm trying to do, Barry, is bring you out of those writings, bring you into the present, and bring you into the delivery in real time.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Happy to do that.
Okay.
Thank
Kayla?
you guys for listening to me. I feel
Oh.
kind of bad.
I like listening to you. You're very articulate.
I feel bad about that.
Well, I know Barry had an agenda, and you know, I'm always a supporter of staying on topic, but when Josh was saying that, it really kind of triggered me a little bit. I'm like, oh hell no, wait. Like, it did take reality TV for people to see. It's been there forever and it's still there. So I don't know what world. So that's why I spoke out. But
That's
Yeah.
it's all
fine.
good.
Well, Barry knows I'm sincerely interested, so I'll definitely follow up with him. But I hope you also know that this is something that's unfortunately all too real and all too oppressed, and I don't know how to do anything other than say I'm willing to help.
See, one of my
Yeah.
objectives is for people who have a different audience than my kind of rarefied audience to represent this material, sort of translate it so that it speaks to a different audience. I can speak to an academic audience of people who have similar academic background, but beyond that, I'm generally talking a different language from what works for the general public.
What else is on the agenda for the rest of Sunday?
I'm going to the beach. I'm just waiting for a friend to call.
Yeah, every Sunday at noon Pacific time, I always have a session with my parents, so I got that to look forward to again.
Cool.
I'll send you guys some of the videos I was referring to, so you know what I'm talking to. But they're all in TikTok, so you'll have to excuse my 3-minute forum.
Is that
So
the typical video length in TikTok, 3 minutes?
Yes, 3 minutes.
Can I view them without being registered on TikTok?
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
Yeah, some of them are really, really interesting.
Yeah, because I'm not on TikTok or Instagram or whatever some of these newer ones are.
You know what would be helpful is, I know you suggested a couple before, but if you have a list of people that you think would be effective for me to follow, I'll do that.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for listening to me rant, and I'll be hopefully a little bit more present next time. I always say that. But happy Sunday.
Yep.
Enjoy the
Happy
rest
Sunday.
of it and the week.
Okay.
Ciao.
All right. Thanks a lot,
Bye.
guys. Talk to you later. Bye for now.